The Queen of a Distant Country by John Braine continued. Ring here, line in the margin, initial here, OKTM. I can't thank you enough, I said. I sat down and sipped the whiskey. Thank me by doing something with your talent. Don't do what I've done. For Christ's sake, keep on writing, no matter what you feel like. Don't keep a diary. Don't write long letters. They're all substitutes for real work. She stopped and lit 2 cigarettes and handed one over to me. Her silver and gold blouse was open to her considerable cleavage, and her legs were unusually well-shaped. But I didn't, as I usually would have done, mentally unbutton the blouse to her waist and lift the skirt beyond her stocking tops. It's a question of time, I said. You've got to make time. Darling, I've got time, but what do I do? Buy First Empire candlesticks and read books I've read before and plan meals, and now and again get mildly pissed, and now and again... She stopped. I wonder why I can talk to you like this. You're so young, and you're a man, but I can talk to you about anything. I can with you. I put something of this into the relationship of my first hero with his mistress, but that was founded firmly upon sex. This wasn't, which was why it was so flattering. Good. Then we'll talk about what you're going to do with yourself. You're not academic, you know. I still have a few friends, and you could get your matric easily enough and then go on to the university. But you'll have to cram a lot of stuff you'll never need again. There isn't the time, and there's always the risk you'll end up teaching or on the BBC. I wouldn't mind the BBC. Death in life, my dear. I've seen it ruin more writers. You'd be better off at your father's shop, believe me. If only you were tough enough, that would be the very best thing. You'll mix with ordinary people all the time, and they're the ones you've got to write about. The thing is, the hell to live with. You get so bloody lonely. The artist has to be lonely. Oh, yes, darling, I believed that at your age. But loneliness leads to marriage and children, and no time at all, because you've got to care too much about your job. You're stuck in one place. No, there's only one thing for it: journalism. I haven't even got my school set. You can learn shorthand and typing. That's the one chore, just one chore. You keep on being published in national papers, and I'll get you a job somewhere in the provinces at first. You want to leave home, don't you? I thought London. So did I once. The same London as you, La Vie Bohème and all that. But it doesn't exist, you know. Not until you've made it, not until you've become a name. She pronounced the last word with relish. All that stuff in moving through, pure wish fulfillment. I suppose most first novels are. But it's no use me telling you, lovey. You want to go just the same. That's what the chalk on the album's really about, isn't it? I asked, referring to a third novel, which I had at long last got hold of. I didn't think anyone had read it, she said. Yes, that's what it's about. How clever of you. But people don't want to read about disenchantment. You're in the enchantment business, my puppet, and don't you forget it. Most of the poor buggers, I was becoming used to her language by now, who make up the reading public, have quite enough disenchantment in their lives already. And booze is the hell of a price, and sex means messing about with Dutch caps or pacing the floor in the small hours with a wet, squalling bundle. So there's us, and the television and the flicks. It's all the same whether you like Tolstoy or Agatha Christie or Hamlet or No Orchids for Miss Blandish. The end product's escape. You mean you should try to give the public what it wants? No, no, she said impatiently. Give yourself what you want. You know about you. You don't know about anyone else. What do you want now? For Christ's sake, get it. She pointed in the direction of the hall. He's happy. He wanted an heir. He's got 2 sons. He wanted to make a lot of money. He's made a lot of money. And now all he wants is to slowly absorb the port his dear old dad put down for him. I sometimes wonder if I shouldn't buy him a television. It'd harm his liver less. Not that he'd have one in the house. Well, it's his liver. She stabbed a red painted fingernail at me. But what about God, though? Is that what you want? No, honestly. I loosened my collar. It was very warm, and this time I was drinking more whiskey than last time. That doesn't mean anything to me. I just want to look at things and listen to people. You'll think about it someday, though. God and all that. It's in your face, and that's the most destructive of all. I knew a man once. Oh, hell, he was my lover for 6 weeks, and he was a poet, Rudy Escher. You won't have heard of him. He became a monk. A bloody monk, I ask you. On his knees day and night for what? What good does it do? He had plenty of money. He'd been all over the world, and his poetry had something. You're not safe where voices are polite, though you may have escaped the right which staggers, scowling outside like a drunken bruiser, its breath smelling of eternity. But that was early stuff. He didn't used to talk about eternity with me. She lit 2 more cigarettes and passed me one. If you write about something well enough, it's there. It's fixed. It won't go bad, though. I was almost frightened to speak. She was so much more clever than I was, had had so much wider a life. Oh, yes, dear Tommy. Look at Ulysses, and look at almost everything else published that year, and you'll see the difference. The conversation turned to literature, with which I felt rather more at ease. I didn't want merely to sit in silence, but when she launched out into personal confidences, I wasn't sure what my answer had to be. I wasn't used to people revealing themselves quite as frankly as Miranda, and I had a mounting fear of saying the wrong thing and being cut off from her suddenly. Above all, at 18, one has a great fear of making a fool of oneself, of being too absurdly shocked of, or parading a sophistication which one doesn't really possess. But as we talked, I felt more and more at my ease. Was it a mother and son relationship? Not precisely, for in that there would have been elements of guilt and shame. We weren't lovers, and we were more than friends. We were teacher and pupil, and I was her only pupil. I was very lucky. Max never interfered with our relationship. Perhaps he was perceptive enough to grasp the fact that we weren't and never would be lovers. But I think not. He simply wasn't interested in whether we were or not. What Dr. Johnson called confusion of progeny would have been a different matter, feeling as he did about the family name. But a disastrous miscarriage had made Miranda incapable of ever conceiving again. Her sterility had also turned him off sexually, though I wasn't aware of this at the time I met him. It wasn't merely that he thought of a wife as primarily a producer of heirs. He had the not uncommon belief that sex, unless indulged in only in the strictest moderation, was not only unbecoming to a man of his age, but positively harmful. About every 3 months he'd knock gently at her bedroom door, but he stayed for so short a time that she never counted it as making love at all. He was merely exercising his marital rights, claiming what was his due. Perhaps, too, as far as I can see inside his mind, he wanted to assure himself of his virility. I think it was essential to him to know that, should the need arise, he could produce heirs again. That evening I had the vague intimations of all this. Already there was a part of me which never went off duty, never stopped making notes. It was a cold night. Spring came late in the Anglesey, and the room was very warm. But all 4 bars of the electric fire were switched on. I began to sweat. And there is another difference between those days and now. Our clothes were heavier, and one had more of them, winter and summer. "Take your jacket off, for Christ's sake," Miranda said. "Why sweat if you don't need to?" I took it off. The action seemed oddly significant. "And why not that woolly pullover?" she asked, but I shook my head. My flannels went a very good fit, and I was wearing braces. She shrugged. "Sweat if you want to, then." She switched off 3 bars of the electric fire. "I like my interiors warm. You'll go to America one day, you know, and then you'll stop wearing woolly pullovers. I wonder what's to be done with you." "You said journalism." "Did I?" "And to learn shorthand and typing." I am bossy, aren't I? I noticed how white and even her teeth were. I didn't know then that they were all capped at great expense. "I don't mind." "No, you don't, my dear. You'll never mind anything which helps you get what you want. The question is whether your parents will mind." "My stepmother won't care either way. My father might be a bit puzzled." "Your stepmother?" "My mother died when I was 8. Heart attack." "You're lucky. Working-class mums, in fact all mums, can be smothering. You've got enough on your plate without having to fight off your mum." "Oh, Christ, I hope I haven't shocked you." "Only a little." "I never mind what I say to anyone much. I'm always quite nice to Max, though, because he's my meal ticket. Do you despise me for that?" "It makes sense. Nothing's any better for being poor." "You sound very grown-up at times. Is your stepmother a wicked stepmother?" I laughed. "No, I quite like her." "You might have had some hellish neurosis if you didn't. And they can be useful to a writer. Of course, they can cripple him, too. Doesn't much matter if they bugger up his sex life. We all have our crosses to bear. But they might well bugger up his writing." "They leave me alone," I said. "They're mainly interested in each other." "Still in business, are they?" I hadn't heard the expression used in this way before, but guessed what she meant. "Very much so, I should think." "Really? I feel a bit envious. Fancy her yourself?" "You don't know my father. He'd break my neck. Anyway, she must be 40 if she's a day." I broke off. For the first time since I'd met her, I was genuinely embarrassed. She smiled. "Don't worry. It's quite normal for you to feel that at your age. And, of course, there'll be a kind of incest barrier. It serves me right for being so bloody personal. But it doesn't seem to matter with you." I noticed properly for the first time the shape of her face. It was oval, with a strong but not heavy jawline. That shape of face stays young longer because there isn't the tendency to sag that there is in a round face. For a moment we were silent, not because we had nothing to say, but because it was enough to be in each other's company. It was a moment of danger. A move from either of us could have made the relationship physical and spoiled it. It was a moment of complete contentment, of a shared tranquility. We were knowing and loving one another. We filled each other's thoughts. I've had a great deal from life, infinitely more than most people, and I've enjoyed it all. But there is nothing for which I am more grateful than that moment with Miranda all those years ago. For both of us, if only for a moment, wanted only to give to the other. There wasn't any question she could have asked me which I wouldn't have answered truthfully. And from that moment onward, I don't believe that I ever told her a lie. She was, of course, exactly what I needed at that period. I often wonder if I don't need someone like her now. More and more I feel that there's a gap in my life which can only be filled by someone of superior wisdom and greater strength, someone to whom my attitude will be not far short of worship. I found no one since Miranda. When it came down to it, all the candidates I chose for her position simply wanted something from me, if only to admire me and look up to me. I have never found this unpleasant, naturally, but I wanted someone to admire and look up to. I needed a queen or a king, but preferably a queen. I needed to give a special kind of love. The moment when our relationship established itself passed. The silence was replaced by questions which carried on from where we had left off at my last visit. She asked me about my siblings. She made no comment when I answered her immediately by telling her what I felt about Lester and Amelia, but I knew that she was impressed. The word isn't as recondite as all that, but no one would have picked it up at 18 who hadn't the collector's instinct for words. "It's better than I thought," she said finally. "Almost made to measure for a writer. You have the experience of family life, which one really can't do without, but there's nothing to tie you down. Your father doesn't have a thing about the family business, does he?" "Not him. He says it's better than working. I expect Lester will take over if I don't want it. Not that it's entirely a bad thing to work in a shop. You see lots of people and you can dream your own dreams. Better than journalism in a way. But you can't stay in Anglesey. You're content here, though?" "Content." She frowned. There were lines on her forehead I'd not noticed before. "I've declared a separate peace, my darling Tommy." It was the first time I'd heard anyone use the phrase, though I recognized its source. "And I'm going into battle." She looked at her watch. "Yes, my love, and it's a dirty, desperate battle." She stood up. "I'm tired." She kissed me briefly on the cheek. "I'll see you at the Copple on Saturday." The audience was over. As I went out, I realized that I felt tired too. I was happy, but I was tired. I turned my overcoat collar up against the wind. I remember that overcoat well. It was at least twice the weight of overcoats today, in a thick brown Melton, belted with a deep collar and extending well below the knee. There was something military about it. Certainly, at a pinch, it would have served as a blanket. A dirty, desperate battle. The metaphor was in my mind as I strode out along the Filey road, the taste of whiskey in my mouth. That long, straight road, bordered by the sea, was not one of my favorite walks. Indeed, because of its absence of any features of the least interest, it always rather depressed me. But that evening I had everything before me. I didn't believe that the battle would be dirty and desperate, but triumphant and splendid. I was too young to realize how it had crippled Miranda. Chapter 7. The check arrived by the same post as the copy of Vanguard containing my article. To this day it gives me pleasure to receive checks and to see myself in print. On that morning in Anglesey, it's no more than the simple truth to say that there was no happiness in my life which had ever come near it. It was all the greater because it was my first success of any kind. I think that only Amelia had any notion of what having the article published meant to me. Her face went pink with excitement, and she turned and kissed me. "Tom, clever Tom. Tom's written a story in real print," she said, which, when I come to think of it, exactly summarizes my own feelings. But the others looked at it briefly with that curious expression I've often noticed on the face of non-readers, as if encountering some unfamiliar species of animal which they suspect might be dangerous. I suppose this reaction was partly owing to the rather forbidding appearance of Vanguard, the typography of which hadn't changed very much since it was founded by a group of minor Fabians in 1910. It was half literary and half political. It had always been its policy to keep politics out of the literary half, which was probably the main reason for its survival. It was a good place to begin from, though the New Statesman might have been a shade better. The lead article was thick with words like rapprochement and détente and bipartisan, and the list of contents included articles on Mauriac and Cocteau and Picasso. To my father and Hetty, along with 90% of the population, it might as well have been written in Sanskrit. The cheque was a different matter. "My God," my father said, "all for a bit of scribbling. Well, lad, it's better than working." "You should put it away for your holidays," Hetty said. "Put it away, be damned," my father said. "Spend it before they find out they've made a mistake." "They haven't made a mistake," I said, "and that's nothing to what you can get from American magazines." "I always said you had a headpiece on you, if only you'd learn to use it," my father said. "You get it from your mother. She always had her nose stuck in a book." I noticed Hetty frown. She didn't like my mother to be mentioned. But my father, I realize now both how annoying and how endearing his insensitivity was to women, never noticed. He looked at the article again. "There's no Clipper Street in Anglesey," he said. "I know. It's not specially supposed to be Anglesey. It's any little seaside town." "You're no fool. Nobody can get at you then, can they?" "And that's the idea." "Will you buy me a present, clever Tom?" Amelia asked, sitting on my knee. "You're the cleverest boy in the whole world." Hetty smiled. "Cheeky. She knows how to get round the men already." "I'll buy you a lovely present," I said. For I did at that moment feel that I was the cleverest boy in the whole world. That was just what I wanted to hear. I bought the present for Amelia, a small pink teddy bear I knew that she'd been hankering after at my cousin Jessie Rimswell's shop. Jessie was a rather plump young man in his early 30s, whose cropped hair and gold-rimmed glasses gave him an oddly sinister appearance. His shop was, at that time, the only newsagent's in Anglesey, and in addition sold sweets and tobacco, and toys and stationery and bric-a-brac of all kinds. It was in a good position midway between the fisherman's quarter and the newer part of the town, and only my grandparents had more money than Jessie. And that was because they'd been in business longer and had picked up more land at lower prices. Jessie was a lay preacher and didn't smoke or drink. He was strenuously cheerful, as was his wife, Madge, who occasionally served in the shop when she wasn't occupied with their 6 children. My father didn't like him very much. He said that, like all these bloody nonconformists, he was hypocritical and randy and gluttonous, and would take the pennies off a dead man's eyes. But already he was of great fascination to me, precisely because he was so different from myself. Even then, I didn't feel myself able to afford the luxury of moral judgments, and though now there are quite a few people whom I'd like to see hanged, it isn't a question of morals, but of survival. It's them or me. Jessie was a source of fascination to me in another way. There were more different kinds of things in his shop than in any other in Anglesey. His shop seemed fuller of articles at every visit. I'm sure that he sold all of them eventually. He had the born shopkeeper's instinct for what people wanted, and though the shop was crammed with objects, it was never untidy or scruffy, and had always a faint, pleasant smell of newsprint and chocolate. The sun had come out that morning, and there was a cold wind. The sign outside the shop was creaking. It was a curiously melancholy sound. Jessie was reading what I recognized as a copy of Vanguard. For the first time I saw the magazines and newspapers on the front counter and in the racks behind the door as the manifestations of a different world, a larger world than Anglesey. And I had entered it. But to stay in it, one day to live in it, depended upon how clearly I could see Anglesey, how clearly I could see Jessie, how clearly I could see the shop and everything in it. And without Miranda's advice, I might have continued for years to write unpublishable short stories and finally an unpublishable novel. I might well still have been in Anglesey, drinking a lot and dreaming a lot, reading a lot in between, but only for escape. There's someone like that in every small town, talented because he has a large stock of knowledge which may occasionally be useful or diverting, but never to be taken seriously. They're generally nicknamed Professor. Their only hope of escape is somehow or other to acquire a professional qualification, to become at least a teacher or a librarian. But drinking and dreaming and the long, dusty grind of examinations are difficult to reconcile. And even then, the bitterness would remain. They say genius will out. I've never believed it myself. If a potential heavyweight champion loses an arm, he's not going to be a boxer, and that's that. And if a writer goes in the wrong direction at an early age, he's not going to be a writer. If I hadn't sent that story to Miranda that morning, I wouldn't have been in Jessie's shop, buying a teddy bear for Amelia and a box of licorice all sorts for Lester and a box of black magic for Hetty and 20 mannequin cheroots for my father. And Jessie, looking up from Vanguard, wouldn't have said in perfect seriousness, "One of these days people'll boast of having known you, Tom." I've never forgotten that. It had the unexpected effect of bringing tears to my eyes. "Nice of you to say so," I mumbled. He looked at the teddy bear. "You spoil that child," he said. "Wait." He rummaged beneath the counter. "I'll do it up properly." He wrapped it up in pink flowered gift paper and tied it up with red ribbon. "She'll like that. Pretty wrappings, half the fun for a little girl." He hesitated, then rapidly wrapped up the others in gold wrapping paper. "We won't spoil the ship for a ha'porth of tar." He gave me my change. I looked at it. "How much?" "My treat," he said. "Mind, you want to look after your money. You haven't won the football pools, you know." But as he spoke, he was caressing Amelia's gift. I had the sensation of being inside his shoes. I realized what it was to have his vocation. I didn't want to evaluate that vocation. It was enough to understand it. I expected that evening at the Cobble to be a festival. I expected some sort of accolade, full fellowship of Miranda's gang. In fact, to be granted commissioned rank. For in every social group, no matter how informal, there are grades. I expected that evening at the Cobble to be a festival. I expected some sort of accolade, full fellowship of Miranda's gang. In fact, to be granted commissioned rank. For in every social group, no matter how informal, there are grades. Before I went in, I stood by the sea-wall, a copy of Vanguard in my hand, for a full half hour. I wanted to delay the pleasure, to savor it in advance, to prepare appropriate responses to the congratulations which were about to be heaped upon me. It had turned cold, but I didn't feel it. I felt slightly sick with excitement, but physical considerations were unimportant. I saw a lifetime of triumph ahead of me. I had begun to be a name. But when I entered the lounge bar and saw, with that curious twinge which is generally described as being in the pit of the stomach, but is, in fact, though non-sexual, in the genitals, that Miranda's gang was already there, No one greeted me except Ralph Thorolby, who raised his pint-pot and mumbled in my direction. Miranda didn't look at me. She was reading a letter which Harvey Abington had just given to her. I sat down opposite her, the copy of Vanguard in my hand. "It's out today," I said. "Of course he doesn't understand," she said to Harvey, seeming not to hear me. "It's the typical English approach. He's always seen writers in terms of movements with a capital M, and he can't realize what a load of bloody nonsense it all is. But don't you say that. Be very humble. Say you appreciate the soundness of his approach, but that you think the time is ripe to consider new methods. But for Christ's sake, say you're sorry that you jumped the gun and that you'd value his opinion. Buy the old sod a meal or a drink." She turned to me. "What's out today?" "Vanguard." "Of course." She smiled. "It's a big moment, isn't it?" She tapped the article with her finger. "How many times have you read it now?" "About 100. Harvey looked at the article. It didn't seem to take him very long, but I could almost hear the click as each line was photographed in his brain. "Not bad," he said. "Decadent, of course, but then it's a thoroughly decadent periodical, pays lip service to the idea of class warfare, has a good old weep about the suffering proletariat now and again, but actually makes its profits from the exploitation of individual sensitivity." "What else is literature about?" I asked. "It doesn't matter what it's about. It's what it's for. Its purpose, my dear chap, is to advance the class struggle." "Fuck the class struggle," Miranda said. "Why can't you say something nice about the boy's article?" "It's competent enough," Harvey said. "Bloody good for a kid his age, but he's already decadent. It's absolutely obvious that he doesn't give a toss about the workers." "Neither do I," Miranda said. "My sweet," he said, his voice changing tone, "that's just not true. I know what your record is, and I know how much you help now." The harshness had gone from his voice, and the accent was even more emphatically that of an officer and a gentleman. "She's helped me," I said. "She'll help you to be a prosperous bourgeois hack who one day will forget the people he came from." Now there was anger in his voice. I realized that this conversation was important to him. He had to make an impression with the gang, just as he had to make an impression as a WEA lecturer. Since then, he's become a Labour MP and television personality and, in the process, reasonably well off. We run across each other from time to time. London's a small place, but I never refer to his communist phase. I listened to him that night, though, and took mental notes. Whenever I've depicted communists in a novel, they've always been based on Harvey at this stage in his career. I didn't bother to argue with him. He was, even then, by way of being a professional talker, and I would have been hopelessly outclassed. I realized, above all, that what he said about me was, in an important respect, true. I didn't give a toss about the workers. I didn't give a toss about politics. I think now that if I'd not met Miranda and through her the gang, I might well have been led, through reading and loneliness and the spirit of the times, to believe that politics had something to give me, that a change in the system of government might significantly change my life. But Harvey cured me of that, and Jane Baddingham, who'd been sitting in silence over an advocat, suddenly broke into the conversation and said something which I've never forgotten. "Do what you want to do, darling," she said. "You're the only person who knows, even if it kills you. Do what you want to." "That's dangerous advice," Ralph Thorolby said. "At this moment I want to put my hand down your blouse." She shrugged. Her white blouse, through which pink underwear was visible, was extremely low cut. The shrug forced up her breasts. "If you want to, you will. Go on." I won't stop you." I watched their faces. Miranda was frowning slightly. Jane was looking at Miranda. Harvey's face had a rather shy, amused expression. Ralph's face was non-committal. The others in the group, aware that something was happening, were turning to watch Jane. Ralph stretched out his hand across the table. There was silence. Then he waved his hand away. "You're a cock-teaser, darling Jane," he said. "Take the will for the deed." "She'll do that once too often," Miranda said. Jane stared at her, faintly smiling, somehow triumphant. I was seized by wonder at the marvelous complexity of human relationships. Hard on its heels came a fear that there wouldn't ever be time enough to understand it. I'd already forgotten that I'd expected to be praised, to be made much of that evening. Now I didn't care what impression I made. I wanted merely to watch and to listen. There weren't any formal introductions to the gang, except on the few occasions when Miranda brought names to Anglesey. But before the evening was out, I managed to introduce myself to everyone there whom I didn't already know. Bill Abercorn and his first wife, Nina, Roy Badgeworth and his fiancée, Kim Cressage, Jack Barrington, Cyril Abbott, Jean Pritchett. Their faces and voices and the way they dressed all comes back to me now. Bill, tall and bulky, with a baby face and a huge forehead, was an actor who was resting and trying to write a play. He was living on Nina's earnings as a secretary. Nina was small and slim and timid, and Bill was apt to bully her. Roy was a primary school teacher who'd done several talks on the BBC. He was a precise, neat little man, smaller than me, with rimless spectacles. Kim was the same size, as if made to order for him, with nondescript features but wonderful legs. Jack Barrington was an accountant with a Scottish accent and literary ambitions which, so far, he'd mainly gratified by articles for the Dalesman and Yorkshire Observer Budget. He was, however, writing a novel. Cyril Abbott was chief reporter for the Anglesey Clarion, and his girlfriend, Jean Pritchett, was a librarian at the county HQ. They were keen on the theatre. The chief manifestation of this keenness was their piercingly loud voices, meticulously going up at the end of each sentence. They were both tall and fair-haired, and almost excessively healthy-looking. I might have fancied Jean, but for her height. Out of the whole gang present that evening, only Bill and Harvey and I have amounted to anything, become names, and when I describe them, they don't seem a very impressive lot. But with the exception of Ralph Thorelby, they were all young. They were all reasonably well-read and well-informed. They all had their ambitions, secret or avowed. They were all middle-class or on the way to being middle-class, and with the exception of Ralph Thorelby, they were all left-wing. Whatever political opinions Ralph had, he kept to himself. Sooner or later I discovered the secret ambitions of other members of the gang. I never discovered Ralph's. I don't think he had any. I believe now that he was content to go through life with the minimum of effort, extracting whatever pleasure he could on the way. He enjoyed his job as English teacher at the nearby grammar school, but I don't think that he was by any means dedicated to it. But this is to look at the gang too coldly, for never before or since has any group of people given me so much happiness. There is no one so lonely as the young man with literary ambitions in a small town like Anglesey, particularly if he's been educated at a secondary modern school. I made no friends at school. I wasn't persecuted, but I simply couldn't mix. I wasn't any good at games either. I've often regretted this as being now an unfillable gap in my experience. Morris was my only real friend, and occasionally with him I would be included in invitations to parties, generally given by a Knossington or a relative of a Knossington. But the Knossington's social life was centered around the chapel, and the chapel wasn't for me. It all boiled down to the question of what one talked about, and at this stage in my life I only wanted to talk about literature and writing. Later I learned the language of ordinary people, and less mixed with literary people. Ordinary people sounds patronizing and isn't accurate, but the real people, the expression I use privately, can only be used in public by a politician with a very strong stomach. It doesn't really matter. What is important is that until now I've always chosen for my material people in whose lives literature, or any of the arts, plays no important part. This was something which Miranda taught me. "You may not like ordinary people," she said to me once. "I doubt whether they like you, but they're the ones you've got to write about. If you want to sink without trace, make the hero of your first novel a sensitive young writer in a small Yorkshire town, because where the hell do you go on from there?" She was quite right, of course, but that doesn't affect what I felt about the gang, and still do after nearly 20 years. With them I was free to speak my mind as I was with no one else. They were determinedly broad-minded and progressive. No subject was barred. I suppose that those evenings at the Cobble were my substitute for the university, with Miranda as the faculty. I don't think that I had a bad education, and I avoided the examination treadmill. The gang helped to make me. I think now that it helped to break Miranda. It prevented her from entering fully into the social life of Anglesey and taking new material from there. She did her duty as Mac's wife, but no more. The longer a writer is silent, the harder it is to start again. Land is all the better for lying fallow, but not talent. Without the gang, loneliness and boredom, if nothing else, might have forced her back to her desk. But the adoration the gang gave her so unstintingly, the pleasure of arranging the lives of its members for them, of being their queen and their oracle, came to replace the grind of creation. And the reviews of her last novel had hurt her more than she cared to admit. What was more, the tone of reviewing had become perceptibly nastier since then. Adverse reviews once were, at the worst, mildly disappointed, trying even then to find something to praise. Now they were full of a savage hatred, as if the subject of the review had not only written an inferior book, but had been guilty of some loathsome crime. And for some reason the hatred would be all the more savage if the author concerned had, like Miranda, ever written a bestseller. Perhaps, too, she didn't dare to risk failure because of what it would have done to her standing in the eyes of the gang. Perhaps she could all too clearly visualize them in the lounge parlor of the Cobble, whispering over the reviews, loyally deploring the reviewer's malignant stupidity when she came in, or, worse still, keeping silent. They wouldn't be her subject any longer. They wouldn't be her courtiers. They'd be a kind of tribunal. I can see all this now. I couldn't then. I simply took all that she and the gang had to give me, and as soon as I was away from her, kicked away the ladder I'd climbed on. I made my duty visits, which were no more than an excuse for me to boast about my triumphs, and went back to my own life. I've never been troubled by a sense of guilt, though I understand it well enough for professional purposes. Mostly, to use another writer's phrase, I see myself as a camera, and who ever heard of a guilty camera? I've avoided guilt until now, just as I've avoided writing directly about my own experience. I haven't looked at myself. There are enough people in that line of business parading their own sensitivity, watching with fascination what they term their spiritual development. They believe in, if I've got the correct phrase, agonized self-appraisal, searching of the psyche at the deepest level, the imposition of a pattern upon their experience. I don't believe that the writer has any business to look at himself at all. I only want now to remember Miranda, but as I remember her, I'm forced to ask myself if I loved her enough. I took, and it was right that I should take, but when the time came that I was in a position to give, did I give enough? Chapter 8. And yet, as I look back only with joy. This was the time when I first started to look at people and places and things systematically. I'd been looking with delight and astonishment all my life, but in fits and starts, my vision blurred by half-digested theories. "Nothing else counts, darling," Miranda said to me, "except making the reader see and feel and smell and hear. Don't let me ever catch you thinking. Any fool with a degree can think. Harvey talks about writing a novel, you know. He'll get it published, but it won't be any good. He's too clever. He has too many theories, and he's too cold. You're a cold bastard in many ways, but not about the things which matter. And I don't mean social injustice and all that crap either. I understand this perfectly now, but at the time I couldn't take it all in. I obeyed my instincts rather than my intelligence. But imperceptibly a worry was removed. I didn't think I was going mad, but more and more, comparing myself with the people around me, I'd begun to feel that there was something wrong, that my impressions of the world about me were too vivid, too keenly sensed, too unselective, that I'd reached the stage where a length of wood in the basement of my father's shop was as important to me as a sunset, or a rainbow, or a swooping seagull. I couldn't see any physical object, animate or inanimate, as being drab. I was hooked on reality. At the age I was then, sex complicated my situation. At 18, one is almost permanently sexually excited, and in my case, almost permanently sexually repressed. I was occasionally invited to parties. I took 2 girls out to the cinema and 1 to a dance, but got no further than a good-night kiss. The fact is that I wasn't a member of any group except Miranda's gang, and there weren't any available girls in Miranda's gang. Very few people meet the opposite sex except as members of a group, and, unwisely, I now consider, I elected not to join the nonconformist group. A little boredom wouldn't have hurt me. I should have acquired a great deal of material which I can now never acquire, and I should have known more girls, and I might even, amidst the boredom, have caught a glimpse of what gave some of the older ones, in particular, a genuine serenity. Miranda wouldn't have approved of me joining the nonconformists, of course. When she thought about it, which wasn't very often, she was an atheist. She wasn't militant about it, but she would have thought of attendance at the Methodist chapel as being a betrayal of my vocation, and nonconformism wasn't intellectually respectable either. A conversion to Catholicism she might have accepted at a pinch. It was, in her own words, so gloriously barbaric, so splendidly reactionary, so fascist and incense-reeking. This was more than 20 years ago. My loneliness, the feeling of being cut off, apart, of course, from Miranda's gang, she positively approved of. "Darling, you're going to have to get used to being on your Todd. You'll be on your Todd your whole life, and never more than when you're married. It has its compensations. In the meantime, I was in a state of sexual repression. I don't think that it did me any great harm. It's even possible that it gave a sharper edge to my writing. There were means, voluntary or involuntary, of relief, but they're too dreary to be worth recalling. What I remember is how attractively packaged girls were then. Perhaps it's the distance of time that does it, but they wore brighter colors. Their hair shone more, their skins were cleaner, and they wore suspenders and fully fashioned stockings, so that even the primmest was a whore beneath her skirts. Even though skirts covered the knees, there were always revelations, accidental or intentional. With luck, for instance, a journey on a double-decker bus could provide a glimpse of white flesh, the memory of which would carry one happily through the day. There was a mystique about women's underwear then, which doesn't seem to exist now to the same degree. I remember the way in which I'd surreptitiously peep at the window of Knossington's, the drapers. What was almost intolerably exciting was that the garments there would cover girls' bare flesh, that knickers, above all, would cover that portion of the female anatomy which was never very long out of my mind. The fact that it's hairy, sometimes exuberantly so, was a bonus, real gold on the lily. I did know all the facts of life. What I'd picked up at school was augmented by reading and the evenings with Miranda's gang, who made a point, if not a fetish, of being frank. All except Ralph assumed that everyone knew the mechanics of the most complicated perversions, but Ralph would always take the trouble to explain. Perhaps it was the consequence of his being a teacher. Perhaps it was the desire to corrupt. Miranda was more likely to direct one to a book if she saw any indication of ignorance on my face, which then revealed my thoughts far more transparently than it does now. I expect that this was one of my main attractions as far as Miranda was concerned. I was someone whom she could mold, whom she could make into her own creation. She, no doubt, loved her sons, but from the little she said about them, they took after Max in having no literary inclinations whatever. I bought a typewriter, an Oliver Portable, I remember, and soon picked up a fair speed. Shorthand was more difficult. It wasn't simply a matter of learning the outlines, but of getting practice. Morris would help me here from time to time, but I was seeing far less of him. He was occupied with his studies and had a girlfriend now, Maureen Ballater, a tall, plump, bouncing girl with a great deal of soft brown hair and what is described as an outgoing personality. He'd met her at college, which was more and more becoming the center of his life, and to add to his problems, she was a Catholic. I hadn't thought of him as having problems before, but there was money trouble at home, his father's coal business having struck a rough patch, and he was beginning to be subject to blinding headaches. On top of this, there were periods when he couldn't keep his food down. Amidst it all, he had to keep abreast of a crowded syllabus, with examinations always looming over him. Morris had a retentive memory and a well-ordered mind, but he was a slow thinker and incapable of taking shortcuts, or of bluffing his way through when he didn't know his subject. Maureen was much quicker and livelier, with a rather sardonic sense of humor. I was inclined to envy him his possession of her. I knew instinctively that they didn't sleep together, but it was evident also that they derived great comfort from each other, that theirs was a mature relationship. As I grow older, I value my friendship with Morris more and more. He's the only person I know who, I'm positive, would always behave decently in all circumstances, and the only person I know in whom there is no trace of envy. If we'd seen more of each other during this period of my life, my morals might have been a little less shoddy. I might have been saved many mistakes. I might have been the giver and recipient of more love. The hero's friend in my first novel isn't Morris, except in patches. Apart from any other considerations, I couldn't then manage to portray simple goodness. I've always had enough sense not to try to bite off more than I can chew. In literature, no A's for effort are awarded. At the time I wrote my first novel, I had just begun to understand something about Morris, but at 18 I was chiefly concerned with surfaces. For company there was Miranda's gang, and I wrote my pieces of what I called reportage. I tussled one evening a week with shorthand. I went to the cinema, almost always by myself, and I wandered around Anglesey, consciously observing. Occasionally I went farther afield to Filey and Bridlington and Scarborough, and as far as York. And now and again I was taken by my father to visit my grandparents in Charbury. That was before the older part of Charbury was, to use the planner's euphemism, redeveloped. In that maze of narrow, cobbled streets dominated by mill chimneys, I knew, though only half-consciously, that I'd found the kind of background which suited me best. But not until he took my grandparents to Ilkley one day in June did I decide, or it was decided for me, where I'd set my first novel.